Thank you for joining us today, and I'm going to start off talking about mind, because we're talking here about the mind of a bee. What is a mind? In what sense do you use the word mind?
So when talking about minds of animals, we refer to the capacity to remember, to think, and to feel, to plan for the future. So any kind of mental capacity is included in the term mind.
Okay. So why do bees need a mind? What do they use it for?
Very good question. So in their natural lives, one of the things that bees need to be good at is navigation. They have to remember where their home base is, because they fly from their native hives up to 10 kilometers. So this is from here all the way over the river, and then a few more kilometers, find a good patch there and navigate all the way back. Now, if you've ever navigated a natural landscape without a mobile phone or a map, just using memory, you can imagine what kind of challenge that is. It requires quite a bit of memory capacity. In addition, you have to be, as a bee, careful shoppers in the flower supermarket. You have to remember, of the dozens of flower species out there, which ones have the most nectar, the highest quality nectar for the lowest cost. And that's pretty much the same as you do when you're choosing your favorite toothpaste in a supermarket. You remember the packaging, you remember what to look for. If you find one product has a good cost-benefit ratio, you stay with the same product. You remember what it looks like and then return to it, unless, of course, the quality goes down or the price goes up. But more broadly, of course, one of the things we explore in bees' minds is their capacity to deal with non-natural challenges that they do not encounter in their daily lives. What kind of problems can they solve in the same manner as people explore in primate minds that they do not normally face in their natural lives? And that includes opening puzzle boxes, pulling strings for rewards, imagining things in their mind. What do they need this for? Not on a daily basis, but in extreme settings where there are novel challenges. Something strange crawled into your nest and you need to remove it. How do you do that? It doesn't happen every day. So for unconventional problems, it's very useful to be able to think and solve problems quickly without trial and error.
And how do we know they have a mind? And is that something that's common among insects?
So how do we know? First of all, we do experiments in the laboratory, as I mentioned, and if bees get something right, then they always get a little sugar reward, as they do in nature, and that keeps them motivated. And so we can test not just their memory for flower colors and scents, but also for challenges such as, can they count? Can they remember the correct number before getting a reward? Can they open puzzle boxes? And so this is how we test the bees. We test their ability to solve such problems by thinking, by internal mental exploration rather than trial and error. We also explore using paradigms borrowed from primates and corvid birds and so on, whether they might be said to have emotion-like states. Again, using laboratory paradigms where, as you mentioned, for example, we ask, do they enjoy play-like activities? Do they like to fiddle with balls even though there's no reward? Do they have negative emotion-like states like pain experiences, for example? So this is how we explore whether insects have minds.
Yeah.
Your second question was?
Is this common amongst, is this unique to bees?
Indeed.
Or is this common amongst insects?
So I think bees are a kind of favorite experimental subject among my colleagues because they're so cooperative, voluntarily with these kinds of experiments, but that doesn't mean that we should underestimate the intelligence of other insects. Wasps, powerfully unpopular because they are more aggressive and so on, but there are species of wasps, for example, that recognize other colony members by their faces. These are small colonies, there's only about a dozen workers, but they all know each other personally, so they recognize each individual by facial features, know which individual is stronger than me, which one is weaker, and so on. So there are surprising discoveries about insect intelligence and other species almost every other month.
And do bees I think you said that you talked about their mind and the way they use that. Do they have a mind as an individual or as a hive?
Very good question. So, of course, social insects solve problems in amazing ways collectively. So if you think about the bee swarm, for example, where a cluster of bees gathers on a tree and then they send out scouts in all directions to find a new location to nest in. And these scouts communicate to the swarm using a kind of symbolic language where they've discovered a location. After a few days, they agree democratically on one location. And then the whole swarm lifts off and flies to that destination. And that, of course, looks as if the whole swarm was a kind of individual, where each individual is just a sensory unit bringing back information. But if you look a little more closely at that decision-making process, of course, the decisions, the memories for locations are still in individual heads. So like humans, they solve problems as a collective, but the minds still sit in each individual brain.
And what does that mind physically look like?
If we had the answer to that in any species, including the human one, we'd have a Nobel Prize right here. We don't know what a mind looks like in humans. We know that it resides in the brain.
Yeah.
So we know what a bee brain looks like. Undoubtedly, they're tiny. And that might mislead one to conclude that they are also simple. But that impression quickly evaporates once you take a look inside a bee brain. So they're very elegantly miniaturized biocomputers. There's only about 1 million nerve cells in a bee brain. But each one of them has the structure of a fully grown oak tree, just very tiny and miniaturized. And each individual nerve cell can have up to 10,000 connection points with other nerve cells, synapses, each of which in turn is at least potentially plastic and subject to experience. So the entire wiring diagram of that brain is still way too complex for us to understand comprehensively. My colleagues with fruit flies are getting there, with getting the entire wiring diagram of an insect brain, but fruit flies, of course, are also pretty dumb compared to bees.
Now, let maybe turning away from the specific points about the mind, maybe to bees more generally, tell us about what your fascination with bees, how did that arise, and what does your work involve on, if you like, on a day-to-day basis?
So I think I got hooked the first time I took a proper look inside a beehive, because what you see there is really a kind of alien civilization. You see thousands of individual bees, all engaged in different tasks. Some engage in the construction of honeycomb, which in itself is already a unique structure. No other animal constructs anything of such mathematical perfection. Other individuals engage in feeding the brood, in grooming the queen, yet others deliver nectar and pollen to the colony and so on. So there's a very careful, efficient interfacing of lots of experts all engaged in different tasks and working together. And once you see this, you realize there's pretty much no other animals that have that sort of social complexity. So that's how I started. My work on a day-to-day basis involves experiments of the kinds that I've described. So we train bees to our setups. Sometimes freely flying bees come into the laboratory. We also keep bumblebees inside the laboratory in small flight cages. And we reward them if they get something right. And they either get nothing or tiny penalties, like, for example, bitter quinine solution, which they really don't like, if they make a mistake. And then we monitor their responses, either just by observing them or by clever automated video analyses, RFID tags, radar tracking of bees, where we follow the bees that we equip with little transponders over their spatial movements outside. We have a radar that can track individual bees for their entire lifetime. So that's the kinds of experiments we do.
And amongst all the projects and the research that you've undertaken, are there particular aspects which have excited you and have really sort of been, if you like, milestones in your journey?
Yes, I mean, the study of bee intelligence is really like a magic well. There is the more you discover, the more questions open up, and then you discover more. So the first such finding was the observation that bees can count, which in the mid-90s actually surprised people quite a bit, because no one had thought that any such thing is possible in an insect. And from there we went to exploring whether bees can form categories, whether they can lump visual objects by criteria that join them. We explored whether they can recognize images of human faces, for example, so things that look completely different from the flowers they normally recognize. We asked, can they picture such things in their minds? And can they discover the same objects that they've only seen previously? Can they discover them using touch in complete darkness? And the answer is yes. And in recent years, we've also explored emotion-like states, where again, just 10 years ago, people would have laughed and said, well, these are insects, they can't possibly feel anything. So, and I imagine that in 2 years, there are things that we today regard as impossible, we might, or my colleagues might discover yet more abilities that I haven't just listed.
And on that point, is there something, what's your burning question? What is it that's on your mind? You're thinking, can the bees do this? Or what's the next stage for you in that sort of journey of discovery of bees?
My dream is, of course, to be inside the cockpit of a bee and see the world as a bee does, with its unique sensory organs and so on. But that's for the far distant future. So one of the things that we're currently exploring and interested in is whether bees have episodic memories, where they can zoom back into the past and recover entire episodes from their memory. Can they think about a distinct past event, where this happened, and what was the sequence of events at the time?
Right. Now, as I said to the audience at the start, there will be an opportunity to speak to Lars afterwards. But if there are any particular questions that people have got at the moment, stick your hand up and we'll come to those. Keep your hands up and we'll come to those in a minute or two. So think about if you have any questions now that you'd like to ask, put your hand up and someone will find you with a microphone. Lars, do bees recognize their beekeeper?
We don't know, but it's at least plausible. So we did an experiment some years back where we trained bees to collect sugar water on a little platform in front of the image of a human face. And you do that a few times, and then you present that face jointly with some alternatives, very much like in a crime witness test, where you have an array of different faces, and the witness has to go, that was the person who stole my camera. And so that's the idea with that experiment. We spatially shuffle them so they can't just remember where they've landed. They have to recognize that face, and they get it right in about 80% of times. So they're very good at recognizing even quite similar faces. But of course, recognizing an actual person in 3 dimensions, irrespective of what clothes they wear at the time or whether they're wearing a hat or a protective veil and so on, is more challenging. There is an interesting story by a lady from Scotland who a few years back adopted a wingless bumblebee queen. These queens live much longer than worker bees, so they live about a year, and gave it shelter and food. And in that case, there was really a kind of friendship that developed. There are plenty of pictures on social media with that lady with a bumblebee queen on her nose or in her hand and so on. And that bee was very comfortable with that particular lady, but not with anyone else who tried to fool around with it at all. So there was a clear connection just between one bee and one person.
Wow. I think we have a question here. Lucio.
Thank you so much. Lars, pleasure to see you here. Can't wait to read your book. It's very, very interesting. My question is, for example, for getting the mind, what about the consciousness? So I know this is even more difficult to prove. You are saying about the mind that we know it's in the brain, or maybe not just there. Are there any proofs, or what's your opinion? For example, we know that there was an experiment with 2 quantum particles. They were separated, but they were still kind of connected to each other. So are we all connected, and are the bees all connected in such a way? Thanks.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, I think it's important to acknowledge that there is no formal proof of consciousness in anything other than language-gifted humans. And we see the difficulty of that in current debates about whether AI systems are conscious or how one might diagnose that. There's no single hard and fast criterion where you can say, aha, now I've proven that thing is conscious. But so what we do instead is, rather than hoping for a formal proof that doesn't exist, is to collect bits of evidence that point in that direction. And these are the kinds of examples of which I've already mentioned. Some, like the question of whether you can flexibly retrieve entire autobiographical memories. So can you think about them at times when they're not prompted by external triggers? Can you plan for the future? Can you think about objects in your head? And are there feelings? Is there evidence for a sentience? And for all of these questions, the answer seems at least very probably yes. So adding all of this up makes it quite likely that there is a form of consciousness in bees. More direct tests involve the question of whether there's an awareness of your own knowledge. Do you feel certain that you know something, or do you feel less certain? And that the answer is also yes. In many animals, of course, what people have asked, can they recognize themselves by way of a mirror self-recognition test? That hasn't been done yet in bees, but what people have done is asking whether bees are aware of their own body dimensions when deciding whether to fly through a small gap or not. So bumblebees within one colony differ quite a bit in their size. Some are very tiny, almost like a housefly, and others very large. And so they are aware as individuals of how big am I? Can I fly through this gap, or is there some danger of damaging my wings? And so this kind of awareness of body dimensions also seems to exist in bees. Can there be a consciousness across individuals? I think the evidence in humans largely is still negative, even though you might undergoing similar experiences. If you're in a band and playing instruments jointly, then it's obvious that the rhythm patterns in your brain will have to be synchronized to some extent. But that doesn't mean that somehow your own consciousness merges with someone else's. So in that regard, I think bees are like humans in that the consciousness, if there is one, is likely still confined to individual heads.
So if I can follow that up then, can we, and you mentioned the example of the Scottish lady, can we as individuals make connections with bees as we do, for example, with dolphins or with primates?
Well, at least the Scottish example, as you call it, makes that plausible. Of course, worker bees live much shorter periods, so they're only around as adults outside the nest or hive for 3 weeks or so. And within that period, of course, that's at least possible. They have very good memories for everything that they associate with rewards or with shelter. So it's certainly possible.
So if bees have a mind, and maybe going back to Lupcho's point, if bees have a mind, I think obviously they do, does it mean then there are more sentient creatures around than we have thought of hitherto? And given the fact, obviously, your research has shown that bees are.
Indeed. So, I mean, the old Descartesian view that we humans are the only creatures equipped with a mind is really crumbling very rapidly. The closer we look at the intelligence and the emotional worlds of other animals, and that includes not just our close relatives, such as primates or other sort of glamorous, warm-blooded vertebrates like corvid birds, ravens, and so on, but also marine creatures like cephalopods and, as we now know, insects. So we are surrounded, we as humans, as thinking and feeling beings, are surrounded by other creatures that also think and feel, however, in very different directions and with very different sensory, perceptual worlds, but still thinking and feeling creatures just like us. And I think that induces, at least in me, a new respect for the world around us.
Well, on that point then, how should we act differently, knowing that bees are, and other insects are sentient things, sentient creatures? How should we therefore adapt our behavior?
Well, there are many ways, of course. I mean, a word of pessimism, we are, I think, well aware that many of the animals we eat, pigs, chickens and so on, are sentient beings, and that doesn't change at least many people's eating habits either. So there is room for improvement. But with insects, of course, I think certainly to the extent that you have control over it, don't spray pesticides in your garden. It's absolutely not required to kill any insects in that way. Just grow plants that survive by themselves. If you must kill an insect, then do it quickly. If you have to kill anything, then common sense dictates that you minimize suffering the more quickly death occurs. So if you have to kill a mosquito, then slapping it, there's nothing wrong. If I get struck by lightning right this minute, I won't suffer. You might be surprised, but or my relatives, but for me, there's no suffering in that case. So to the extent that you encourage children as a fun game to sort of burn up ants with a magnifying glass, not a good idea.
Now, I think we had one other person here who put their hand up. Please.
So my name is Budi. I'm a biology teacher and I'm also an MSc biology student in here. I'm so glad to have you here today. So thank you so much. And my question is about bee colony disorder. So we know that this phenomenon, many people blames it to neonicotinoid pesticide. So I just want to ask whether you have this kind of research where you investigate what happened in the mind of the queen bee, worker bee, or the drones right before the colony collapse happening, and what can we learn from it for our human society, let's say? Is that anything unique that you observe in that colony collapse disorder? And the second question is about how to avoid observational bias in any animal ethology research so that we are not anthropomorphizing our observation results. So it's interesting to see the result, but again, how to avoid this bias, because we are human, right? And that's different species. Thank you so much, Professor.
All right. So colony collapse disorder, the phenomenon that occurs in honeybees when large numbers of bees die or abandon their colonies, is a phenomenon largely limited to the USA, and it's largely the result of powerfully ruthless, bad beekeeping. So there are beekeepers who have thousands of colonies, and they're rented out for commercial pollination events in various parts of the country where they're all loaded on trucks. They dump thousands of bees from different hive origins together in a box, just thinking, okay, it's a box of bugs, no matter if they're a family, transport them all across the country, and then expose them to plantations that are covered in pesticides, not just neonicotinoids, but also others. And then they're complaining to us scientists, all our bees are dying, do something about it. So the reasons are obvious. And of course, these pesticides are designed to kill insects. It's no wonder that bees, like other insects, succumb to them. And even if they don't consume them by way of eating vegetation, of course, the bees consume them via bringing back nectar, which affects their nervous system and in many cases slowly kills them. It affects their navigation, their learning and memory in all kinds of ways. So it's no surprise that these things are harmful to bees just like other insects. They're also harmful for us, by the way. Your second question was?
Well, we can maybe come to the second question afterwards, because I'm afraid our time is up on this stage. But you can join Lars for a more informal conversation in the library inside in about 10 minutes' time. But I'd be very grateful if you could put your hands together and give a warm round of applause to Lars Chittka.
Thank you very much.